I should have been relieved when the fire alarm went off. It was one of those perfect suburban evenings, dinner on the stove, kids playing upstairs, the kind of night you imagine when you sign up for marriage and fatherhood. But the alarm wasn't the problem. It was what I found when I rushed to the backyard, thinking maybe the kids had tried lighting sparklers. Instead, I saw Emily. My wife. She was standing on the patio, staring at a small fire pit. Nothing too unusual, except that in the flames were pieces of what I recognized as our wedding album. The one we made together after our honeymoon, with the handwritten captions and pressed flowers she insisted on keeping from the bouquet. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking with the sheer force of confusion. Emily didn't flinch. She turned to look at me with the kind of calm that makes your blood run cold. "It's just old stuff, Jonathan. Let it go." I froze. Let it go? Our wedding album wasn't stuff. It wasn't a box of receipts or junk mail. It was the foundation of our life together, everything we promised to be for each other. And now it was going up in flames like it meant nothing. She grabbed a poker from the side of the pit and pressed it against the remaining pieces, her movements deliberate, almost calculated. It wasn't an act of passion or anger, it was surgical. "Emily, stop." I lunged forward, yanking the poker out of her hand. She stepped back, her expression unreadable, like I was the one overreacting. "What's going on? Why would you? I don't want it anymore." Her voice was steady, void of emotion. She brushed past me and walked inside without another word, leaving me standing there with smoke curling into the night air and the faint smell of burnt memories choking my lungs. I should have followed her, demanded an explanation, but I couldn't move. My mind scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't Emily, not the Emily I knew. The woman I married wouldn't throw away our life like that without a reason. I stared into the embers, my hands gripping the poker tightly. And then I saw it, a scrap of a photograph not yet fully consumed by the fire. I fished it out, burning my fingers in the process, and turned it over. It was a picture of us at our first dance. Except someone had scrawled across my face with a thick, black marker. That was the moment I knew something was seriously wrong. And I was going to find out exactly what it was. The next few days passed in a haze, but my mind was anything but foggy. Something was wrong, and Emily's behavior was a glaring neon sign pointing to it. Her cold detachment, the almost surgical precision with which she burned away our past, was not just unusual, it was outright alarming. I didn't mention the wedding album again. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed answers first, and asking her outright would only make her defensive. I've learned that much about people over the years: guilt pushes them into corners, and cornered people are unpredictable. So, I started paying attention. Emily worked 3 days a week out of an event management office and often spent weekends at client sites. It had been her routine for years, but this time, I watched closely. On Thursday morning, I offered to drop her off at work, a simple gesture I hadn't done in years. She hesitated for a second, her lips tightening, before giving me an uneasy smile. "That's sweet, John," she said, her voice too light, too rehearsed. "But I've got to run some errands after work. I'll need my car." "Errands?" I asked casually, sipping my coffee. "Just boring stuff, groceries, dry cleaning, that kind of thing." She waved it off, walking briskly to the fridge to grab a water bottle, as though the conversation were already over. "Sure," I said, masking my skepticism. After she left, I waited a solid 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I didn't have a plan, just a gnawing instinct to act. I pulled my car a few houses down from ours, switched off the engine, and watched. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, Emily drove past. I tailed her, careful to keep my distance. She didn't go to the office. Instead, she drove across town to a small cafe on the edge of downtown. I parked a block away and watched as she stepped inside. It was the kind of place we used to go to when we were younger, intimate, with large glass windows and outdoor seating. The kind of place that practically begged for whispered conversations and stolen glances. Emily took a seat at a corner table, her back to the entrance. A minute later, a man joined her. He was younger than me, maybe late 20s, with the kind of confidence that radiated from his posture. He leaned in close, smiling as he spoke, and she smiled back, really smiled. The kind I hadn't seen in months. My stomach twisted as I watched them. It wasn't the kind of meeting you'd have with a coworker or a friend. There was something intimate about the way she tilted her head, the way his hand rested briefly on hers as he talked. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my gut was screaming at me. I stayed in the car, watching for over an hour. At one point, they laughed, she threw her head back, and he reached across the table, brushing her cheek like it was the most natural thing in the world. I clenched the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When they finally stood to leave, I snapped out of my daze. My heart raced as I debated what to do. I could follow them, confront her, or maybe just walk away. But I needed proof. I needed something undeniable, something she couldn't wriggle her way out of. I waited until they exited the cafe and watched them walk to the parking lot together. They didn't kiss or hug, but there was a familiarity in the way they moved, a silent understanding between them. He climbed into a sleek black sedan, and she returned to her car. I stayed a safe distance as she drove off, but instead of heading home, she went to her office. That night, I acted normal. We had dinner as a family, talked about the kids' school projects, and even laughed about a silly meme Alex had found. Emily seemed relaxed, unbothered, like she hadn't spent the afternoon with a man who wasn't her husband. But I wasn't relaxed. The next day, I took it a step further. I called her office under the guise of being a potential client. I'd like to speak to Emily about planning an event, I told the receptionist. I'm sorry, she said. Emily's out of the office today. Can I take a message? I hung up, my suspicions growing. That afternoon, I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. A guy named Ray, recommended by a friend who'd gone through a messy divorce. He was efficient, direct, and not interested in small talk. I gave him all the details I had, her schedule, her habits, the name of the cafe, and he promised to get back to me within a few days. By Monday, I had answers. Ray handed me a manila folder, thick with photographs and reports. I opened it, my hands trembling. The first image hit me like a sledgehammer, Emily and the man from the cafe, sitting side by side in a car. The timestamp read 9:37 p.m. on Friday. The next few photos showed them walking into a hotel. I flipped through the pages, bile rising in my throat. There were receipts for dinners, notes about late-night meetings that coincided with her errands, and a clear pattern of lies spanning weeks, maybe even months. Ray's report ended with a list of facts. The man's name was Chris. He worked in marketing at one of the venues Emily frequently partnered with for her events. The affair had likely begun at least 3 months ago, based on the evidence he'd gathered. I sat there in my office, the folder spread out in front of me like the autopsy of my marriage. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the cold, calculated way she'd gone about it. The deliberate lies, the effort to cover her tracks. She hadn't just cheated, she'd dismantled the trust we'd built piece by piece, brick by brick. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stared at the pictures and felt a quiet, searing rage take root deep inside me. The Emily I thought I knew was gone. Now, I just had to decide what to do next. Emily came home that evening like she always did, calm, collected, and unbothered. She placed her bag on the kitchen counter, kissed Alex on the forehead as he worked on his math homework, and asked Ethan about his soccer practice. It was a picture-perfect moment, except for the fact that I now knew the truth. I waited until the kids went upstairs to get ready for bed. My mind was calm, a strange sort of calm I didn't expect. I had rehearsed this moment in my head all day, but nothing could fully prepare me. I had the manila folder hidden in the bedroom, ready for when I needed it. Emily, I called from the living room, my voice even. She glanced up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling mindlessly. Yeah? We need to talk. The change in her posture was immediate. Her body stiffened, her eyes narrowing slightly as she placed the phone down. Okay, she said, feigning casualness. I motioned for her to follow me into the bedroom. Once inside, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. She stayed by the dresser, arms crossed, her expression wary. "What's going on, John?" For a moment, I just looked at her. Studied her face. The woman I had loved for over a decade, the mother of my children. She seemed the same, but now I knew her actions had created a chasm between us that I couldn't ignore. "How long have you been seeing him?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Her eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second, before she caught herself. "What are you talking about?" "Don't insult me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Chris. The man from the cafe. The hotel. How long has it been going on?" Emily's face flushed red. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her lips pressing into a tight line. For a moment, it looked like she was going to deny everything, but then her shoulders slumped. I don't know what you think you know, but it's not what it looks like," she stammered. "It's not what it looks like?" I repeated, my tone dripping with disbelief. I reached under the bed and pulled out the folder, tossing it onto the mattress between us. "Go ahead, take a look. Tell me what this is, then." She didn't move. "You don't want to see it?" "Fine, I'll tell you," I continued, my anger bubbling to the surface. "These are photos of you and Chris. Dinners. Hotel visits. Lies about errands and work meetings. There's enough in here to destroy any argument you think you can make." Emily's hands trembled as she took a step back. "John, Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't try to explain it away. Just tell me the truth. How long?" There was a long pause, the silence stretching between us like a taut rope ready to snap. Finally, she whispered, 3 months. 3 months. I felt my stomach churn at the confirmation. "Why?" I demanded. "Why would you do this? After everything we've built, after everything we've been through, why?" Her gaze dropped to the floor. "I don't know," she said weakly. I was unhappy. It just happened." "Unhappy?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Unhappy how? When did you ever tell me you were unhappy? When did you ever say anything that could have made me fix whatever the hell this is? You didn't even give me a chance." I didn't know how to say it, she shot back, her voice cracking. "I didn't want to hurt you, John. I didn't know how to talk about it without admitting you were screwing someone else." I finished for her. "Well, guess what? That's 1,000 times worse. You didn't just hurt me, Emily. You obliterated everything we built. You lied to my face. You burned our memories. How do you justify that?" She wiped at her eyes, but I didn't see any tears. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything," she said softly. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I laughed bitterly. "No, Emily. A mistake is forgetting to turn off the oven or leaving your wallet at home. You don't accidentally go to hotels and lie to your husband for 3 months. That's a choice. A calculated, deliberate choice." Her face crumpled, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt or just the discomfort of being caught. I never stopped loving you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Don't," I said coldly. "Don't you dare say that. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. If you loved me, you wouldn't have lied every single day." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything hung in the air, suffocating. "What do you want me to say?" she asked finally, her voice hollow. "I want you to admit it," I said. "Admit what you've done. Admit that you've ruined our marriage, and stop pretending it was just some meaningless mistake." Her jaw tightened, and for the first time, she looked angry. "Fine," she snapped. "I cheated. I screwed up. Are you happy now? Is that what you wanted to hear?" "No," I said quietly. "I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want any of this. But at least now I know who you really are." Her anger deflated as quickly as it had risen, and she sank into the armchair in the corner of the room, burying her face in her hands. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice muffled. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone. "Now," I said, "I decide if there's anything left to salvage. Or if this is where it ends." I left the room before she could respond. For the first time in our marriage, I needed to be alone to think. I spent the next few days walking a tightrope between fury and cold, calculated purpose. Emily's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was an insult to the years I had poured into building our life together. Her flimsy excuses and half-hearted apologies didn't erase the fact that she had made deliberate choices to destroy everything we had. So, I made a choice of my own. If she thought she could get away with turning me into a fool, I'd show her what it felt like to be on the receiving end. I started by securing my position. Emily didn't know that our joint accounts were as vulnerable as her lies had been. I transferred the majority of the funds into an account she couldn't access. I left enough behind to avoid suspicion, but not enough to make her comfortable. Next, I made copies of all the evidence Ray had gathered. Photos, timestamps, hotel receipts, it was all cataloged and ready. I wasn't just holding on to it for leverage, I had plans for it. My next move was subtle, almost surgical. I began withdrawing from her emotionally, but not in a way she'd notice outright. I stopped initiating conversations, made myself scarce around the house, and feigned indifference when she tried to engage. She was still pretending to mend things, likely out of guilt, but I wasn't interested in her half-hearted attempts. Then came phase 2. One evening, while Emily was at a supposed work dinner, I set up a meeting with Chris. It wasn't hard to find him, his social media was a roadmap of his life. I approached him at a bar he frequented, a trendy spot downtown where people went to be seen. I wasn't there to cause a scene, I wanted something more effective. He was seated at the bar, nursing a craft beer, when I slid onto the stool next to him. "Chris?" I asked casually. He turned, eyebrows raised, clearly trying to place me. "Yeah, do I know you?" "You don't," I said, offering a thin smile. "But you know my wife. Emily." The blood drained from his face so fast I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Relax," I said, leaning back. "I'm not here to punch you or make a scene. I just thought we should have a little chat." He nodded slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the bar. "Look, man, I didn't mean." "Save it," I interrupted. "I'm not interested in your excuses. What you meant or didn't mean doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you're done. As of tonight, you're going to disappear from Emily's life. No calls, no texts, no emails. You're going to block her, delete her, and pretend she doesn't exist. Got it?" He looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "Yeah," he muttered. "Good," I said. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone in your life knows exactly who you are and what you've been doing. And trust me, I have the receipts to back it up." I slid a copy of Ray's report across the bar. "Consider this a preview." Chris flipped through the pages, his face growing paler with each one. When he reached the last page, he nodded again, this time more emphatically. "Okay. I get it. I'm out." "Smart choice," I said, standing up. "Oh, and one more thing, if I hear even a whisper of you near her again, we won't be having another polite conversation." I left him there, staring at the evidence of his stupidity, and walked out into the night. It was a small victory, but it was satisfying nonetheless. Back at home, I prepared for the final stage of my plan. Emily still had no idea I had hired a lawyer. I had kept our interactions to a minimum, letting her believe I was processing my emotions while she tried to make amends. She had no idea that I'd already filed for divorce or that I intended to use every ounce of evidence I had to ensure she walked away with as little as possible. I also made a point to quietly inform a few key people in her life about what she'd done. Her closest friend, Megan, was appalled when I showed her the photos. "I can't believe she would do this," Megan said, shaking her head. "I thought you guys were solid." "So did I," I replied. but I thought you should know. She might need someone to lean on after this." By the time I was finished, Emily's web of lies was unraveling faster than she could spin it. I wasn't just exposing her infidelity, I was dismantling the image she had built for herself. On Friday evening, I set the stage for the final act. I arranged for the kids to stay with my sister for the weekend, ensuring they wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. Once Emily came home, I told her we needed to talk. She followed me into the living room, her face wary but hopeful. "Is this about us?" she asked hesitantly. "It is," I said, motioning for her to sit down. She did, her hands folded in her lap. I handed her a folder, this one containing the divorce papers. She stared at it, confusion giving way to panic as she flipped through the pages. "John, what is this?" "It's exactly what it looks like," I said, my voice calm. "I've filed for divorce. And before you try to talk your way out of it, you should know that I'm not changing my mind." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at me. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," I replied. "You made your choices, Emily. Now I'm making mine." She started to speak, but I cut her off. "Don't bother with apologies or excuses. I'm done listening. You've had 3 months to think about what you were doing. Now it's my turn to move on." She crumpled into the couch, her sobs muffled by her hands. For the first time, I felt nothing for her, no sympathy, no anger, just a hollow sense of relief. As I walked out of the room, I knew there was no going back. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. And it was exactly what she deserved. By the time Monday rolled around, the house had become a cold, quiet battlefield. Emily spent the weekend alternating between pleading and retreating into silence. I didn't engage. Each time she tried to approach me, I either walked away or gave her curt, one-word answers. My lawyer had advised me to keep my distance and avoid unnecessary confrontation, but even without that advice, I had no energy left to fight. The kids came back Sunday night, oblivious to the storm brewing between their parents. I kept up appearances, smiling as Alex showed me his latest Lego creation and asking Ethan about his upcoming soccer game. Emily stayed in the background, her face pale and drawn, as if she'd aged a decade in a week. On Monday evening, I decided it was time for the last conversation. The one where we laid everything bare and figured out what was next. I waited until the kids were in bed, then called Emily into the living room. She entered cautiously, like a trespasser in her own home, and sat on the edge of the couch. I took a seat across from her, keeping the coffee table between us like a line neither of us dared cross. "I want to talk about how this ends," I began. Emily's hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. "John, please. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But can't we try to fix this? For the kids? For everything we've built?" Her voice cracked, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I reminded myself of the lies, the hotel visits, the months of deceit. "This isn't about the kids," I said, my tone firm but calm. "This is about you and me. And I can't see a way back from this, Emily. You didn't just cheat, you broke my trust. And without trust, there's nothing left." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "I was stupid, John. I let my feelings get the better of me, and I made a mistake. But I love you. I've always loved you." "Love?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. "You call this love? Sneaking around, lying to my face, putting our family at risk? That's not love, Emily. That's selfishness." She flinched at my words but didn't look away. "I wasn't thinking clearly," she said. "I know it doesn't make sense, but I felt lost. I didn't know how to talk to you about how I was feeling." "And what exactly were you feeling?" I asked, my voice tinged with bitterness. "What was so unbearable that you couldn't come to me? What made you think running to him was the solution?" Her shoulders slumped, and she stared at the floor. "I don't know," she said softly. "I guess I felt invisible. Like you didn't see me anymore. We were so caught up in the kids, the house, our routines. I felt like we were just roommates. Her words stung, but they didn't absolve her. So instead of talking to me, instead of working on this together, you decided to blow it all up, I said. Do you even realize what you've done? To me? To us? To our family? Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she nodded. I know I've ruined everything. I hate myself for it. But John, please. I'm begging you. Don't throw us away. I sat back, letting her words hang in the air. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think there was still something worth salvaging. But the rational part of me knew better. Trust wasn't something you could glue back together once it shattered. I'm not the one who threw us away, I said finally. You did that the moment you decided I wasn't enough. Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. I waited until she calmed down before continuing. I've filed for divorce, I said, my voice steady. It's not just about what you did, it's about what I need. And I can't be with someone who betrayed me like this. She looked up, her face a mixture of shock and despair. John, no. Please. Don't do this. It's already done, I said firmly. The papers are filed. The only thing left to decide is how we handle this for the kids. She shook her head, her tears flowing freely. What about counseling? Can't we at least try that? For their sake? I considered her words for a moment. Counseling might help us figure out how to co-parent, I said. But it won't fix this marriage. I'm sorry, Emily. I just can't. Her sobs turned into quiet, ragged breaths, and she nodded slowly. I don't want to lose them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do whatever it takes to make this as easy as possible for them. Good, I said. Because they're the only reason I'm willing to stay civil through this process. They don't deserve to be caught in the middle. We sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on us. Finally, I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. I'll sleep in the guest room, I said. We'll figure out the logistics in the morning. She nodded, her eyes filled with a pain I couldn't bring myself to comfort. As I left the room, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. There was no going back now, no undoing what had been done. It wasn't the ending I had envisioned for us, but it was the one she had chosen. And now, it was time for me to choose what came next. The first days after our final conversation were eerily quiet. Emily moved around the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. I mirrored her behavior, keeping my interactions limited to logistical necessities, what the kids needed, who would handle school drop-offs, and which bills had to be paid. We were still under the same roof, but it already felt like we lived in different worlds. The kids were the hardest part. I could tell Alex and Ethan sensed something was off. Kids always do. They asked fewer questions about why Mom and Dad didn't eat dinner together anymore or why Dad was sleeping in the guest room, but their silence was loaded with unspoken worry. I tried to keep my answers vague but reassuring. Mom and I are working through some things, I told Ethan one night after he asked why we didn't watch movies together as a family anymore. Are you getting divorced? Alex blurted out, his tone a mix of fear and accusation. I froze, unsure of what to say. We don't know yet, I finally said, even though the decision had already been made. But no matter what happens, we both love you. That will never change. Alex nodded, but his expression told me he wasn't convinced. Ethan just looked down at his plate, pushing peas around with his fork. The house felt like a prison after that. Every corner was filled with memories of the life I thought we had. The picture of Emily and me on the mantle from our 10th anniversary, the kids' hand-drawn Father's Day cards pinned to the fridge, even the faint scuffs on the floor from the time we danced after too much wine. Now, all of it felt hollow. On a Thursday afternoon, my lawyer called. Good news, he said. Emily has agreed to sign the divorce papers without contest. We can finalize this quickly if everything stays on track. Great, I said, though the word tasted bitter. It's not common for cases like this to resolve so smoothly, he added. You should count yourself lucky. Lucky. The word rattled in my head for hours after the call. Was I lucky? Sure, the legal side of things would be straightforward, but there was no denying the wreckage left behind. That night, Emily knocked on the door of the guest room. I opened it to find her standing there, her face pale but composed. She held a manila envelope in her hands. "What's this?" I asked. "The papers," she said quietly. "I signed them." I stepped aside, letting her enter. She placed the envelope on the desk, her movements slow and deliberate. "Thank you," I said, unsure of what else to say. Emily didn't move to leave. Instead, she turned to face me, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "John, I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, and I know you probably don't believe me, but I am." I stared at her, trying to decipher the sincerity in her words. "I believe you're sorry," I said finally. "But it doesn't change what happened." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I wish I could take it all back. I wish I had been brave enough to talk to you before everything." "So do I," said, my voice heavy. We stood there in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "What happens now?" "You'll stay here with the kids until we figure out a schedule," I said. "The house will be yours. I've already talked to my lawyer about transferring it over. It's what's best for Alex and Ethan." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You're giving me the house?" "It's not about you," I said. "It's about them. They need stability, and this house is home to them. I'll find a place nearby so I can still see them often." She nodded, her expression a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "Thank you," she whispered. I walked to the desk and picked up the envelope. "I'll drop these off at the lawyer's office tomorrow. Once everything is finalized, we'll figure out the rest." Emily lingered for a moment before turning to leave. Just before she stepped out, she paused. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I didn't answer right away. The question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe. But not today." After she left, I sat at the desk and opened the envelope. Her signature was there on every page, neat and precise. It was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. Over the next few weeks, I began the process of rebuilding my life. I found a small apartment a few miles away, close enough to see the kids regularly but far enough to give myself space to heal. Moving out was harder than I expected. Packing up my belongings felt like erasing myself from a life I had built brick by brick. The day I left, Alex hugged me tightly, his small arms clinging to my waist. "Are you sure you have to go, Dad?" "I am," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "But I'll see you all the time. This isn't goodbye." Ethan didn't say much, but his quiet goodbye was enough to break me inside. Emily stood by the door, her face unreadable, as I carried the last box to my car. "Take care of them," I said, glancing back at her. "I will," she replied, her voice barely audible. Driving away felt like stepping into the unknown, a strange mix of fear and relief coursing through me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. It's been a month since I left. The kids visit often, and we've fallen into a new rhythm. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Emily and I remain civil, exchanging updates about the boys and coordinating schedules without hostility. I don't know what the future holds, but I've stopped looking back. I've realized that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about letting go of the power it holds over you. Emily made her choices, and now I'm making mine. It's not the life I envisioned, but it's mine to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, I feel ready to do just that.